Welcome everyone to this lecture on the subquery. In this lecture, we're going to be discussing how to perform a subquery as well as how to use the exists function in conjunction of a subquery. A subquery allows you to construct more complex queries, essentially performing a query on the results of another query or using the results of another query. The syntax is relatively straightforward and involves the use of two select statements. Let's imagine some hypothetical table that consists of the student names and their resulting test scores. So it's a very simple table of just two columns, which means a standard query on this table, if you wanted to grab everything, would look like the following. We say select the student column, comma, grade column from test scores. And this will return back two columns, the student's name, such as Jose, and then their grade, let's say 95%. Let's imagine you wanted to grab the average grade across the entire class. Then you would just say, select average grade from test scores. So we already know how to grab all the information from the table, as well as the average score or average grade from all the students. Now let's imagine you wanted to answer this question. How can we get a list of students who scored better than the average grade? Given what we already know so far, it looks like we need to actually do this in two steps. First, we would have to get the average grade and then write that down somewhere and then compare that to the rest of the table against it to filter out the students. This is where we can actually use a subquery. So, this is where a subquery can help us get the results in a quote-unquote single query request. Essentially, just needing to type out everything one time. So the way we would do this is the following. We would say select student grade from test scores where grade is greater than, and here in parentheses we have our subquery where we're going to have select average grade from test scores. So notice what we're doing here. We're first going to run the code that's inside the parentheses, the subquery, and that's going to return back the average grade across the table. Then we're going to be able to use that result in order to select students who have grades greater than the average. So recall that inside the parentheses, since this is going to be run first, this is going to yield some sort of result, such as 70. And then, once that subquery is done and returns its results, SQL is then going to run this other query outside of the subquery. So, you'll end up getting a list of students and their grades where they happen to be above 70 or whatever the average happens to be. So this allows us to simply type this out instead of having to do two separate queries, writing the results out of one and then using it in another. And this is now going to be flexible to any changes within the table. The subquery is performed first since it's inside the parentheses. Keep in mind we can also use the in operator in conjunction with a subquery to check against multiple results returned. For example, let's imagine we wanted a subquery that operated using a separate table. So we wanted to grab the students and grades from the test scores table where the student happened to be present inside another table. So we could do this with a join, possibly, but the other way we could do it is with a subquery. So we could, in our subquery, say, select the student name from the honor roll table, and then that will yield back some results of the student names. For example, let's say Zach, Chris, and Carissa are the students in the honor roll. And then, after that subquery is done executing, we can say, select the student and their grade from test scores, where a student is in this list of students. So note here, this seems to follow along very similar to a join, but sometimes, especially for complex queries, it's easier to think of them as a subquery. Now, the exists operator is used to test for the existence of rows in a subquery. Typically, a subquery is passed in the exists function to check whether or not any rows are returned with the subquery. So a typical syntax would look like this. We say select some column name from some table name where exists and then the actual subquery. So select column name from table name where we have some sort of condition. And then that's going to return true or false depending on whether or not there were any rows returned. So subqueries and exists are really best learned through example. So let's go ahead and jump to pgadmin and work through some examples of using a subquery as well as the exists function within pgadmin. Okay, here I am inside pgadmin. Let's go ahead and work through an example similar to what we saw in the slides of a subquery. So to do this, I'm going to first select everything from the film table so we can remind ourselves what the format is. It looks like the film table has film ID, title, description, etc. And it also has a rental rate. Let's go ahead and calculate or return back the films that have a rental rate that is higher than the average rental rate for all the films, similar to the test score example. So the way we do that is we start off by, if depending on how you want to work this from the inside out or the outside in, let's go ahead and start with the subquery. So the subquery should be first calculating that average rental rate. So the average rental rate of all the films, if we expand on this, we can go ahead and see it's $2.98. So this is going to be our subquery. Instead of having to use the scratch pad and write down this number, let's go ahead and have this be more dynamic. Wrap this in parentheses, so now it's a subquery. And then what we're going to do is say select. Let's go ahead and select the title column and the rental rate column from the film table where, and here we're going to say rental rate is greater than, and it's going to be greater than the results of this subquery, which is $2.98, which means when I run this, I should see back all the rental rates here, $4.99, $2.99, etc. These are all greater than $2.98. Okay, so notice here that the subquery in parentheses will get executed first in order to calculate that average, and then it becomes part of this larger query. The other thing that's important to notice is this particular subquery returns back just a single value, the average rental rate, which means it's okay to use a comparison operator against it, such as is equal to, is greater than, is less than. If your subquery, however, returns back multiple values, then you need to use the in operator on it. So let's work through a more complex example where we're going to actually use a join along a phase subquery. So subqueries can actually have a join in it. So first, let's explore a couple of tables that we haven't seen in a while, so I just want to make sure we remember them. I'm going to select everything from the rental table. So if we run this and expand this back out again, we have a rental ID, a rental date, inventory ID, customer ID, and then we have a return date, which is what we're going to be focusing on, and then a staff ID and a last update. We also have inventory. So let's check our inventory table. Run that. This has an inventory ID, film ID, store ID, and then a last update there. So let's imagine we have a situation where I want to actually grab the film titles that have been returned between a certain set of dates. So if we go back to select everything from rental, we have this rental date. Let's go ahead and grab all the films that have been returned between, let's say, May 29th of 2005 and May 30th of 2005. So that would be select, in this case, everything from rental. And then we're going to do here is say where this return date, if we come back here, we have this return date is between 2005 and let's say May 29th and 2005 May 30th. So we run this, and now everything here has been returned basically on May 29th. Okay. So notice here that in the actual rental table, I do not have the film ID. So if I want the film ID, I always need to join this rental table with inventory, which actually connects the inventory ID. Because notice here I have an inventory ID, so I can use that in conjunction with the inventory table to then grab the film ID. So I have a specialized primary key for each rental, and then I have the inventory ID. So I'm going to use that. So let's say instead of selecting everything from rental, we're going to say select inventory dot film ID from rental, and let's perform a join on this. So we'll say in our join on inventory dot inventory ID equal to rental dot inventory. Make sure we spell this right. Inventory underscore ID. Now let me zoom out just a tad so we can see this whole thing. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to grab the film ID from the inventory table because it's not available to me on the rental table. And then I can use the inventory ID column that happens to be in both inventory and rental table in order to join these together. And then I'm filtering based off the return date. And if you want, you can specify the return date being part of the rental table, but it's only found in the rental table. So you can either do where rental.return date or just return date because it's exclusive to just one of the tables. So you don't need to specify what actual table we're looking at. So let's go ahead and run this. And now I get back this list of film IDs. So this is a list of all the film IDs that happen to be returned between these two dates. Now let's imagine I wanted the title of these. Well, what I could do is I could use this as my subquery, and now I have this list of results, which means I can use the in operator. Again, note the subquery is returning back multiple results, so I can use the in operator. And now I could just say select film ID, comma title from film, where the film ID is in, and then we have this list of film IDs. So I run this, and now I get back the film ID as well as the title. Keep in mind, PostgreSQL is going to operate this as efficiently as possible. So the order is not going to be maintained. If you do want to do some sort of ordering, you would do that at the very end after this last parentheses, because technically this subquery happens first. It gives you back that list. Then you organize everything here, and then at the very bottom on the last line, make sure it's outside the parentheses of the subquery. You can say order by something like title, and it will order by title. Or alternatively, you can order by the film ID. Okay, so that is a subquery using the in operator because the subquery returns back multiple results. And finally, let's walk through an example of using the exists operator. Let's imagine we wanted to find customers who have at least one payment whose amount is greater than 11. And we actually want to grab the first name and last name of those customers. The way we can do this using the exists operator is the following. We'll say select the first name and last name from the customer table, and we'll go ahead and say customer as C, where, and this is where we're going to use the exists operator. So recall that the exists operator basically just checks to see if rows exist in the actual return subquery. So that means we're going to do this. We're going to say exists, and in the subquery, we'll say select. We'll just go ahead and select everything from, and we'll say payment as P, where, just put this on multiple lines. It's a bit easier to read. We'll say where P dot customer ID is equal to C, which is the original customer table, dot customer ID, and amount is greater than 11. So note what we're doing here. We're going to say select the first name and last name from the customer table, where, and then the exists operator is checking to see if any rows are returned based off this subquery. Or we're saying select everything from the payment table where the payment customer ID matches the customer ID and the amount they paid, which comes from the payment table. If you want, you could say P.amount, but amount is exclusive to the payment table, so we don't need to clarify further, is greater than 11. So if we run this, we get back the names of, in this case, if I expand on this, these 8 people. So these are the first and last names of people who happen to have at least one payment whose amount is greater than $11. So in this example, what's happening is for each customer in the customer table, the subquery checks the payment table to find if that customer made at least one payment. So if that particular customer made at least one payment using this matching criteria and that the amount is greater than 11. If you wanted to do the opposite of this, essentially check for customers that have not made any payment greater than $11, you could add a not operator in front of exists there. Run this, and then you would get back Basically, any customer that did not happen to be one of those 8 customers. Okay, that's it, and I'll see you at the next lecture.